Welcome to a place where love doesn't ask for permission, and hearts awaken long after the world says they shouldn't. Here, every story begins not with a spark, but with a silence that's broken by a glance, a touch, a presence that sees you. These are not just stories of passion, but of deep soul, stirring connection, stories of being chosen, not for what you give, but for who you are, where whispered moments turn into something unforgettable, where a woman who thought love was behind her suddenly finds it standing in front of her. If you've ever longed to feel seen again, to feel wanted deeply, not just in body but in spirit, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. Subscribe now, because here, we don't tell fairy tales. We tell the truth your heart remembers. It started like most things do, quietly, with no sign it would change anything. He had been around for years. Polite, easygoing, always respectful, there were memories of his voice echoing through the house alongside laughter, video games, and the occasional slammed door. Back then, he was just part of the background, another boy growing into himself, loud and full of life. But time shifts things, reshapes people. He left for college, life went on, and somewhere between then and now, silence settled into the house like dust. Not loud, not demanding, just always there. The kind of silence that doesn't need to say anything to make itself known. The kind that fills empty chairs and cold sheets and long evenings that stretch too far into the night. It wasn't just about loneliness. That word feels too small. It was the feeling of being invisible in one's own skin. Of being passed by, looked through, never quite touched. Days layered on top of each other like thin pages in a forgotten book, each one turning with no one reading anymore. And somewhere deep beneath it all, something quietly ached to be seen, not for what had been, but for what still was. The first time he visited again, it felt like nothing had changed. He walked in with that familiar mix of energy and comfort, his presence still fitting into the walls like he never left. He smiled the same way, laughed at the same old jokes, but there was something different now, not just in him, but in how his eyes moved. They lingered, not long, not bold, but just enough to be felt. Enough to make something flutter that had been still for too long. The conversations were still innocent then. Weather, work, old memories, plans. But there was a shift, slow and subtle, like warmth creeping into cold fingers. He noticed things most others didn't, asked questions that weren't about the surface, listened, not just politely but deeply, and every time he leaned in to hear, every time his eyes softened with real attention, it felt like something in the silence cracked. There was no clear moment when it changed. It just happened in small pieces, a touch that lingered a second too long, a glance that held a quiet question, a moment in the kitchen when his fingers brushed hers and neither moved away. Nothing was said, but everything was felt. For so long, the skin had been touched without meaning, or not at all. Now, every brush of his hand felt like a sentence written directly into the body. There was a night when they sat on the couch talking, the room dim and quiet, and he said something simple, something about how strong she always seemed. But it wasn't the words. It was the way he said them, like he saw the softness underneath and didn't flinch, like he wasn't praising the mask, but the person behind it. That night changed something, not in action, but in energy. The space between them no longer felt casual. It was charged, full of unsaid things, full of silent permission. The next time he came over, he stayed longer, helped clean up after dinner. The laughter was easier, warmer. When she turned to reach a glass, his hand was suddenly there, close, steadying, not on her back, but lower. Still gentle, still soft, but not by accident, and she didn't move. That moment stretched, not in time, but in weight. Every inch of space between them shrank until even the air felt warm. There had been no intention, no plan, no fantasy, just the growing ache of being seen after so long of being unseen. To be looked at like that again, not with pity or curiosity, but desire, was almost too much to hold. She had forgotten what it felt like to be noticed not for what she gave, but for who she still was. Not for being a mother, a wife, a friend, but a woman, a whole one, with skin and breath and hunger. It would have been easier to step back, to ignore the signs, to laugh it off and return to safe ground. But safe hadn't felt alive in years. The next time their hands touched, he didn't let go. And when she looked up, his eyes didn't look away. They said everything neither of them had dared to say. It wasn't fast. It wasn't wild. It was slow, careful, reverent, like he knew what it meant to be touched like that after being untouched for so long. Every kiss felt like a question and an answer at once. Every caress rewrote the way her body had been taught to forget itself. He didn't rush, he didn't demand, he stayed, he looked, he loved, and the most terrifying part wasn't that it happened. It was how right it felt, like something she hadn't even known she needed had finally arrived. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was disappearing. She felt wanted, not just in body, but in spirit, seen not as something to pity or praise from afar, but something worth holding again and again. And it wasn't just about the nights, the touches, the whispered gasps in the dark. It was about the mornings after, the way he looked at her when the sun was up, the way he stayed, the way he spoke, the way he made it feel like there was nothing shameful in being loved again. It wasn't a fantasy, it was real, messy, complicated, but full of something raw and beautiful, something that made her feel like she was living instead of simply existing. He wasn't just her son's friend anymore. He became the one who saw her when no one else did, and when he touched her, he reminded her what it meant to feel alive again. It never felt like a choice, not really. It felt like something slowly unfolding, like a quiet thread being pulled tighter every time he was near. It didn't start with intention, and that was what made it so powerful. There were no grand gestures, no reckless leaps, just soft, slow moments that wrapped themselves around the heart and refused to let go. It was in the way he stayed after everyone else had gone, the way the evenings stretched longer when it was just the two of them. At first, they talked like anyone would, light-hearted, easy, unassuming. But somewhere in those late-night conversations, something changed. His words grew slower, more thoughtful. His voice dropped just slightly, lower and quieter, as if the space between them didn't need volume, only presence. He started asking questions that no one else ever asked, not about routine or chores or responsibilities, but about feelings, memories, fears. He listened in a way that didn't rush. He didn't try to fix anything. He just stayed there in the silence between the sentences, like he understood there were things even silence couldn't hide. One night, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The lights were dim, the house asleep, and the clock kept ticking like it didn't want to interrupt. His hand was resting just inches away. It was nothing at first, just the closeness, but then he looked over and something in his eyes stayed. He didn't look away quickly like he used to. He didn't break the moment. He held it, and so did she. There wasn't anything said then, just the quiet recognition that they were both too aware of each other now. Something had shifted, something had begun. The accidental touches started to feel less accidental. When he passed behind her, his hand would brush the small of her back. When she laughed, he'd sometimes reach for her arm, his fingers lingering a little too long. Each time, the touch was soft, fleeting, but it stayed long after it was gone. He started calling more, not for any reason, just to talk. Some nights he'd show up without warning, claiming he was just in the neighborhood. They'd sit and talk about nothing, but the air always felt thick, like a storm waiting to break. He never pushed, never crossed a line too fast, but his presence filled the room differently now. He looked at her like she was something he wasn't supposed to want, but couldn't stop wanting. And she felt it deeply in the way her heart responded, not with fear, but with longing. There was a night when it all came undone. She had made dinner not for any occasion, just out of habit. He stayed late again, helping clean up, laughing about something small. And then the power went out, a sudden, silent flicker. The whole house went dark. Candles were lit, and the shadows danced along the walls. The quiet wrapped around them like a blanket, and for a moment the world felt suspended in time. He stood near the window, looking out at the streetlight flickering in the distance, and she watched him, watched the way his shoulders moved, the way his jaw tensed slightly, as if holding something back. She stepped closer, not thinking, not calculating, just drawn forward by something she no longer wanted to ignore. He turned, their eyes met, and this time neither looked away. There was no speech, no big confession. Just a silence so full it begged to be broken, and he broke it gently with a whisper barely above breath. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening." She didn't answer, she didn't need to, she just stepped closer. And then he kissed her. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't hungry, it was reverent, like he had been waiting a long time to touch something sacred. His hands were careful, unsure at first, and then more certain as she leaned in instead of pulling back. Every inch of space between them disappeared, replaced by something that had been building for weeks, months maybe. What followed wasn't chaos, it wasn't reckless, it was quiet, deep, full of everything that had gone unsaid. His touch was slow, warm, searching. He didn't take, he gave, over and over again, in the way he held her, the way he kissed her, the way he looked at her like she was something rare. And when it was over, he didn't leave. He stayed, wrapped around her like a promise no one dared to speak. That night didn't solve everything. It didn't erase the years that had come before, but it opened something that had been locked away. A door that could no longer be closed. What had started as tension, quiet, silent, building, had finally broken wide open, and the truth poured out like light. He never made it feel like something stolen. Never made it feel like it had to be hidden in shame or tiptoed around like a fragile, forbidden thing. When he looked over after it all, when the room was quiet and the air still held the warmth of breath and skin, he didn't look away like most men do. He didn't shift, didn't roll onto his side or reach for his clothes or check the time. He stayed. There was something in the way he stayed that said more than anything else. He didn't speak it, but it was there, in his eyes, in the curve of his mouth, in the way his hand rested gently across her stomach, like he was trying to memorize the shape of the moment. He looked at her like she wasn't a secret, like she wasn't a regret already forming in his mind. He looked at her like a man who had made a choice, and that changed everything, because too many times moments like these end with silence, with a body cooling in a bed that suddenly feels too empty, with a door closing and a heart that beats louder in the quiet. But this time was different. This time something stayed, something settled, something said, "I'm still here," even in the middle of the night when the room was dim and the only light came from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. His hand didn't leave hers. He shifted, but he didn't pull away. When she turned toward him, uncertain for a breath, he smiled, softly, without words, like he knew exactly what she needed. There was no rush to leave, no need to pretend it hadn't happened. What they had done wasn't just about wanting. It was about being wanted in that raw, real way that goes beyond the body. The kind of wanting that sees all the history, all the flaws, all the years and fears and doubts, and still says yes. He didn't kiss her like she was something broken or someone he needed to fix. He kissed her like she was whole, like he didn't see what was missing, but everything that was still there, and when he touched her, it wasn't out of need but reverence. As if she was a story he had been waiting a long time to read. She had forgotten what that felt like, forgotten how it feels when someone looks past what the world sees and chooses to see more, not just the skin, not just the years, but the fire that still lived underneath. The part of her that hadn't died, only gone quiet, and he made it loud again. It would have been easy to dismiss it all, to write it off as loneliness or a passing thrill. But nothing about him felt like a moment. He wasn't someone just passing through. There was a steadiness in the way he came back again and again, the way he showed up, not just when it was convenient or when the nights were warm, but when life was messy, when she was tired, when the world felt too loud. He made space for her without ever asking her to shrink. He laughed at her dry humor, remembered small things she had only said once, and called just to hear how her day was going. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't press for promises, but he gave presence, and somehow that was more intimate than anything else, because it's one thing to be desired, it's another to be chosen. He chose her, not despite everything, but because of it. Because he saw something that wasn't finished, something still beautiful, still worth loving. When she looked in the mirror now, it wasn't just her own reflection she saw. It was the way his hands moved over her with such quiet certainty. The way his eyes softened when she walked into a room. The way his voice dropped just slightly when he said her name. He didn't need to say he loved her, not then, not right away. Love was in the way he held her when the rest of the world felt too far away. It was in the way he remembered how she took her coffee, in the silence between the words, in the way his breath slowed to match hers at night. This wasn't about filling a void or escaping something broken. It was about finding something rare, something sacred, and even if no one understood it, even if it didn't make sense on paper, it made sense in every heartbeat, every glance, every shared moment that couldn't be denied. It was real, it was terrifying, but it was right, and that was all that mattered. There had been a version of herself that she hadn't seen in years, not because it was gone, but because life had a way of slowly folding parts of a person into the background. Responsibilities, routines, the quiet erosion of passion, all of it layered over that woman she once knew. She had stopped looking for her long ago, but somehow, without effort, without even knowing what he was doing, he found her. It wasn't in some grand moment or wild declaration. It was in the simple ways, how he looked at her when she wasn't trying to be seen, how his gaze held no judgment, only presence. He wasn't trying to fix her. He wasn't asking her to be anyone else. He was just there, in front of her, fully awake to who she was, and in that awareness, something shifted. It began in her body, yes, in the way his touch made her feel. But it went far deeper, because he didn't just touch skin. He touched memory, touched parts of her that had long gone silent. He traced lines on her that weren't physical, lines made of years, of wounds, of forgotten fire. And each time he did, something stirred beneath the surface. She had spent years being what others needed, a role, a structure, someone solid, dependable, selfless, and she had worn that strength like armor. But there was something so intimate, so devastatingly gentle in the way he moved around her, like he knew strength wasn't the absence of need, it was the courage to feel again. There was a night when he sat across from her, just quietly watching as she talked about something she didn't even think mattered. And then he said, without hesitation, "I don't think you realize how deeply beautiful you are when you talk about something that stirs you." She didn't answer at first, just stared, because that wasn't the kind of compliment she was used to. It wasn't about appearance. It wasn't about what she could give or how well she carried herself. It was about something inside, something that had felt small and tired for too long. And the way he saw it, like it was something sacred, that's when it truly began, not the attraction, not the physical pull, but the quiet rebuilding of who she remembered being before the world asked her to forget. He would reach for her without needing a reason, press his hand into the small of her back as if to remind her she wasn't alone, look at her across a room like she was a secret worth guarding, and not once did she feel like an escape or a second thought or a fleeting thrill. She felt like a beginning. There was something in the way he said her name, slow with meaning, like every time he spoke it, he was anchoring her back into her own body, into her worth, into the truth that she wasn't just aging, she was becoming. And when he held her, it was never rushed. There was always a pause, always a breath, always a reverence in the way his hands found her, as if he knew he wasn't just touching skin, he was unwrapping something sacred. Something asleep but waiting. She used to see her reflection and wonder where she had gone. The eyes still looked back, but the light inside them had dulled, not from pain necessarily, but from quiet forgetfulness. The kind that creeps in when no one bothers to really see you anymore. But now there were moments when she caught herself smiling without realizing it, when she walked a little slower past the mirror. Not because of vanity, but because something inside her had returned, something alive. He didn't promise her forever, he didn't need to. What he gave her was something more real than that. He gave her now. Fully, intensely, without apology, and in doing that, he gave her back to herself. There was a night when he simply lay beside her, no words, no need for touch, just his breath matching hers, his presence quiet and grounded. And in that stillness, she realized something. She wasn't waiting to be loved anymore. She was being loved, and not for what she could provide, not for what she had done or what she had sacrificed, but for what still lived inside her, the passion, the warmth, the fire. The woman who had once laughed louder, touched deeper, cried more openly. The woman who had been buried under years of being what everyone else needed. He found her, and not only did he wake her up, he stayed. He made space for her, spoke to her like she mattered, touched her like she was art, loved her like she was the last thing he wanted to lose. That kind of connection, it doesn't just change a heart, it redefines an entire sense of self. It makes you remember the sound of your own breath when it's caught between hope and hunger. It brings you back to a place where love isn't something you perform, but something you become. She didn't fall in love with him only because of how he made her feel. She fell in love with the version of herself he helped her see again, and that, more than anything, was the miracle she never saw coming. If this story touched something quiet inside you, don't let it go. Like, subscribe, and come back for more stories that don't just stir the heart, they awaken the soul.